My sister's husband tried to blackmail me with fake evidence, but when I turned the tables, their marriage fell apart, and then. I always knew there was something off about Derek, but I never imagined he would go this far just to get money out of me. Ever since my sister Natalie married him 5 years ago, I could sense there was something lurking beneath his polished exterior. On the surface, he played the role of the charming, successful businessman who always knew the right thing to say, but deep down, I could tell he was a master manipulator. Every interaction with him felt like a game I didn't know the rules to, as if he was always one step ahead, waiting for the right moment to strike. I should have trusted my gut years ago, but I ignored it for Natalie's sake. She had always been the golden child in the family, the one who did everything right. Great career, beautiful house, and, at least in my parents' eyes, the perfect marriage. Meanwhile, I was just the younger sister who focused on work too much and had yet to settle down, which meant any concerns I voiced about Derek were dismissed as paranoia or jealousy. So, when I received an anonymous email one night with a series of disturbing photos attached, I instantly had a sinking feeling about who was behind it. The email was short and to the point, with a subject line that read, "You might want to keep this quiet." The message itself was even worse, a simple demand for $50,000 in exchange for keeping some supposed evidence from ruining my career. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of scam, just another generic blackmail attempt targeting random people online, but when I opened the attachments, my blood ran cold. The images showed me in what appeared to be a dimly lit nightclub, sitting across from a well-known client of mine, a man who had been investigated for financial fraud last year. In the pictures, it looked like he was handing me a thick envelope stuffed with cash, and the timestamp placed the supposed meeting just 3 weeks ago. I sat frozen at my desk, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing, because I knew without a doubt that these photos were completely fake. For starters, I hadn't even been in town 3 weeks ago. I had been attending a work conference out of state, with receipts and hotel reservations to prove it. But more than that, I had never even met this man outside of a professional setting, and I certainly had never taken any bribes from him or anyone else. The more I studied the images, the more I started noticing the little inconsistencies, the way the lighting didn't quite match, the slightly unnatural angle of my head, the odd blur around my hands where the envelope was supposedly being passed. It didn't take a forensic expert to realize these pictures had been doctored, but whoever had made them had put in enough effort to make them seem real at first glance. I was still staring at my screen in disbelief when my phone buzzed on my desk, and I almost jumped out of my chair. It was a message from my best friend, Jessica, asking if I was still coming over for dinner like we had planned. I hesitated for a moment before replying, my fingers shaking slightly as I typed out a quick response telling her I was on my way. I needed to get out of my apartment and clear my head, because if I stayed there any longer, I was going to drive myself insane overthinking every possible scenario. When I arrived at Jessica's place, she took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. We had been best friends since college, and she could read me like a book, so there was no point in trying to pretend everything was fine. As soon as I showed her the email and the photos, her reaction was exactly what I expected: shock, followed by pure rage on my behalf. She was the kind of person who never backed down from a fight, and within minutes, she was pacing her living room, muttering under her breath about how we were going to track down whoever was behind this and make them regret ever trying to mess with me. We spent the next 2 hours analyzing the photos in detail, zooming in on every shadow and pixel to find more proof that they had been faked. Jessica, who had always been a bit of a tech nerd, managed to pull up the metadata on the files, hoping it would give us some clue about where they had come from. That's when we got our first real lead. The timestamps on the images had been altered, but buried in the file details was a name: Derek. The moment I saw it, my stomach twisted into a knot so tight it felt like I couldn't breathe. I had suspected him from the beginning, but seeing actual proof that he was behind this made it all feel horrifyingly real. Jessica let out a sharp curse and slammed her laptop shut, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and determination. She didn't even hesitate before saying exactly what I had been thinking: That bastard is trying to frame you. It all made sense now, in a way that sent a cold chill down my spine. Derek had always been the type to play mind games, and he had never liked me, despite his efforts to pretend otherwise in front of Natalie. Over the years, I had caught him in little lies, small inconsistencies in his stories, strange financial decisions he never quite explained, the way he always seemed to be involved in some shady business deal that didn't add up. But I had never had any concrete proof, and every time I had tried to bring it up to my family, Natalie would get defensive, insisting that I was just looking for reasons to dislike him. Now, though, there was no denying what he was doing. He had fabricated evidence to blackmail me, and if he was willing to go this far, there was no telling what else he was capable of. Jessica wanted to go straight to the police, but I wasn't so sure. The last thing I needed was to cause a scandal at work before I had enough proof to completely destroy Derek's lies. If I played this wrong, he could twist the story, make it seem like I was the one trying to cover something up, and knowing how manipulative he was, I didn't doubt that he would try. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed more than just a suspicious file name and some bad Photoshop work. I needed undeniable evidence that would expose him for the fraud he was. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent promise to myself. I wasn't just going to stop Derek from blackmailing me. I was going to take him down so completely that he would never be able to pull something like this on anyone else ever again. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but one thing was certain. He had picked the wrong person to mess with. The next morning, I woke up with a splitting headache, my mind still reeling from the discovery that Derek had tried to frame me. I had barely gotten any sleep, tossing and turning as I replayed every interaction I'd ever had with him, searching for clues I might have missed. It wasn't just the blackmail attempt that bothered me. It was the realization that he had likely been planning this for a long time, carefully setting the stage to make me look guilty when the time was right. If he had gone through the trouble of fabricating evidence against me, there was no telling what else he had done behind the scenes to ensure I had no way out. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when Jessica called, her voice sharp and filled with purpose as she told me she had spent half the night researching digital forensics. She had found a few tricks that might help us track the IP address from which the email had been sent, but she warned me that if Derek had half a brain, he would have covered his tracks well. I wasn't expecting a direct confession in digital form, but I was hoping for something, anything, that could tie him to this mess in a way he couldn't talk his way out of. We spent the next few hours trying every trick we could think of to trace the email, but Derek had been smart enough to use an anonymous service that made it nearly impossible to track. It was frustrating beyond belief, knowing he had done this to me and not being able to pin it on him in a way that would hold up in court. I wanted to march into his house and throw the evidence in his face, but I knew better than to confront him without a solid plan. If I pushed him too soon, he would go straight to Natalie and spin the story into something that made me look like the villain. Instead of acting on impulse, I decided to take a different approach, one that required patience and careful maneuvering. I reached out to a private investigator named Lucas, a guy I had met through a coworker who had once used his services to catch a cheating spouse. He was in his late 30s, with a no-nonsense attitude and an impressive record of digging up dirt on people who thought they were untouchable. When I explained my situation, he listened without interruption, only asking a few pointed questions before agreeing to take the case. Lucas didn't sugarcoat things when he told me this wasn't going to be easy. Derek had obviously gone through a lot of trouble to make his evidence look real, which meant he wasn't just some amateur looking for quick cash. He was methodical, patient, and dangerous in ways that I hadn't fully grasped until now. Lucas suspected Derek had done this before, possibly to other people, and he told me outright that if Derek had a history of blackmail, there would be a trail somewhere. People like him always left loose ends, no matter how careful they thought they were. While Lucas started digging into Derek's past, I decided to play my own game by acting as if nothing was wrong. I showed up to a family dinner that weekend, pretending to be my usual self while secretly watching Derek for any sign that he knew I was onto him. He was as smug as ever, making his usual passive-aggressive remarks about my career and my lack of a serious relationship, always slipping in those little digs that made my parents think he was just joking. Natalie, oblivious as always, laughed along with him, completely unaware of the man she had married. It made me sick to my stomach to sit there and smile, knowing that she had no idea what he was capable of. But I knew that if I wanted to take him down, I had to be patient. I had to let him think he was winning. A few days later, Lucas called with his first major breakthrough. He had managed to find an old lawsuit involving Derek from nearly a decade ago, a case that had been quietly settled out of court. The details were murky, but it involved a former business partner who had accused Derek of fraud and extortion. It wasn't exactly the same as what he was doing to me, but it was close enough to suggest a pattern. Lucas suspected there were more cases like this, ones that never made it to court because Derek had either paid off his victims or intimidated them into silence. The more I learned about him, the more I realized that Derek wasn't just a manipulative liar. He was a full-blown predator who had likely been getting away with this kind of thing for years. The thought of how many people he had hurt, how many lives he had ruined, made my blood boil. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person he had ever done this to, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it this time. Lucas and I decided that the next step was to bait him into making a mistake, something that would expose him in a way that he couldn't deny. We needed him to believe that his plan was working, that I was scared enough to comply with his demands, so I drafted a fake email in response to the blackmail message, telling him I was willing to pay but needed more time to gather the money. I kept the tone desperate, making it sound like I was terrified of losing my job and willing to do anything to keep the scandal quiet. I hit send and waited, my heart pounding as I wondered how long it would take him to respond. Less than an hour later, a new email popped into my inbox, this one even more threatening than the last. He told me I had 1 week to deliver the money, or he would send the photos to my boss, my coworkers, and even my parents. The arrogance in his words made my skin crawl, but at the same time, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had taken the bait. Lucas had already set up a system to track any further communications, and while we still couldn't get a direct IP address, we were starting to notice patterns in the times and locations from which the emails were sent. It was only a matter of time before we caught him slipping up, and when we did, I was going to make sure he paid for every single thing he had ever done. In the meantime, I continued playing my role, making sure not to raise any suspicion while gathering as much evidence as possible. I started recording every interaction I had with Derek, noting every comment, every smirk, every slip of the tongue that might come back to haunt him later. The hardest part was pretending to be friendly, sitting across from him at family gatherings while resisting the urge to throw his lies back in his face. But I knew that if I wanted to win, I had to be smarter than him. I had to be patient. And when the time was right, I was going to destroy him in a way he never saw coming. A week passed, and Derek still had no idea that I was setting him up, which only confirmed what I had always suspected. He was arrogant enough to believe he was untouchable. He didn't suspect for a second that I was baiting him, that every email he sent demanding money was being carefully tracked, logged, and prepared as evidence for the moment I decided to take him down. The more I played the part of the terrified, desperate victim, the more emboldened he became, his messages getting more aggressive, his threats becoming more explicit, as if he enjoyed watching me squirm. The worst part was knowing that, in his mind, he had already won. He thought he had backed me into a corner where I had no choice but to give in, and he was getting cockier by the day. The most infuriating thing was how normal he acted around the rest of my family, slipping effortlessly into his usual role as the devoted husband, the charming brother-in-law, the successful businessman with everything under control. I watched him laugh with my parents, flirt with Natalie, tell stories about work like he wasn't actively trying to ruin my life behind the scenes. Every time he smiled at me across the dinner table, I had to fight the urge to throw my drink in his face and scream the truth for everyone to hear. But I knew better than to lose control. If I wanted to destroy him, I had to let him think he was still the one in power, right up until the moment I pulled the rug out from under him. Jessica, who had always been the more impulsive one between us, was struggling to keep her cool as much as I was, constantly urging me to just confront him already and get it over with. but I kept telling her the same thing. If we went to my family without undeniable proof, Derek would find a way to twist the story, make me look like the villain, manipulate my parents into thinking I was just trying to stir up drama out of jealousy or spite. I had seen him talk his way out of worse situations, and I refused to let him get away with it again. Lucas, on the other hand, was completely calm, methodical, and unshaken, which was exactly why I had hired him in the first place. He had seen men like Derek before, narcissists who thought they were too smart to ever get caught, who believed they could outthink everyone around them, who had spent their whole lives getting away with things because no one had ever had the patience to stop them. And Lucas had a plan. We weren't just going to expose Derek's blackmail attempt. We were going to catch him red-handed, in a way that would leave no room for excuses, no opportunity to manipulate his way out of the situation. We had already proven that he had doctored the photos, but that wasn't enough. I needed something bigger, something undeniable, something that would not only prove what he had done to me, but also leave his entire reputation in ruins. That was when we decided to set up the drop. I sent Derek another email, playing my role perfectly, telling him I had scraped together as much money as I could, but that I needed to meet in person to hand it off. I made it sound like I was terrified, like I didn't trust any electronic transactions, like I was scared someone at my bank would notice something suspicious if I withdrew such a large amount all at once. I even threw in a few desperate-sounding lines about how I just wanted this to be over, how I couldn't sleep at night knowing what he had on me, how I would do anything to make sure it never got out. Derek took the bait instantly. He agreed to meet me the following night, choosing a parking garage downtown, the kind of place where no security cameras were positioned in a way that would catch anything useful. It was almost laughable how predictable he was, how he thought he was being careful when, in reality, he was walking straight into the trap we had laid for him. What he didn't know was that Lucas had already arranged for hidden cameras to be set up in key locations, ensuring that every second of our interaction would be recorded from multiple angles. When the night of the drop came, I felt an odd sense of calm, like the anxiety I had been carrying for weeks had finally settled into something solid and unshakable. I wasn't afraid anymore, not even when I saw Derek standing there in the dimly lit garage, hands in his pockets, that same smug smirk on his face as I approached. He thought he had won. He had no idea that, in less than 20 minutes, his entire world was going to come crashing down around him. I played my part flawlessly, acting nervous, stammering slightly as I told him I had brought the money in cash because I didn't want anything traced. I pulled out the envelope, deliberately thick with folded paper instead of actual bills, and hesitated just long enough for him to get impatient. That was when he made his first mistake. He reached for the envelope, his fingers tightening around it, his eyes glinting with greed as he prepared to walk away with what he thought was his victory. I let him take it, let him open it, let him see the worthless stack of paper inside. And then, before he could even react, I pulled out my phone, hit play, and let his own words destroy him. The audio recording was crystal clear, every single threat, every demand for money, every smug remark he had made in our previous emails spoken aloud in his own voice. His face went pale as the words echoed through the garage, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to come up with some kind of excuse, some kind of lie that could save him. But before he could say a word, Lucas stepped out from the shadows, holding up a second phone, one that had been recording video of the entire exchange from the moment I had arrived. Derek knew, in that instant, that he was done. He lunged for me, pure panic in his eyes, as if he thought he could somehow physically stop me from exposing him. But Lucas was faster, stepping between us, his voice calm, but firm as he told Derek exactly what was about to happen. We had him on camera, accepting the fake money. We had his threats on audio, his emails traced, his entire scam laid out in a way that no amount of lies could erase. If he didn't want this footage sent to my employer, the police, and every single person in his professional network, he had exactly one option: walk away, confess everything to Natalie, and disappear from our lives before I made sure he lost everything. For the first time since I had met him, Derek had no words. He just stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his face twisted in an expression I had never seen before. Pure, unfiltered fear. I held his gaze, letting him see just how much I had stopped being afraid of him, how much power I had taken back, how there was nothing left for him to manipulate. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming next. The drive back from the parking garage felt surreal, as if my body was moving on autopilot while my brain struggled to catch up with what had just happened. I kept replaying Derek's expression in my mind, the exact moment he realized he had lost, the sheer panic in his eyes when he understood that there was no escape this time. For weeks, he had been playing this game, convinced that he was in control, that he could manipulate me into silence the same way he had manipulated countless others before. But the second I exposed him, the second I showed him that I had been the one pulling the strings all along, everything changed. I had never seen him look so powerless, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally felt like I could breathe. When I got home, Jessica was already waiting for me, pacing my living room with her phone in her hand, clearly anxious to hear how it all went down. The moment I walked through the door, she stopped mid-step, scanning my face for any sign that something had gone wrong. But when I gave her a small, satisfied nod, the tension in her shoulders melted, and she let out a breath she had probably been holding since I left. She immediately demanded every detail, barely letting me get a word in before she started celebrating the fact that Derek had finally been exposed for the lying piece of garbage he was. Lucas had already sent me copies of the recordings, making sure I had everything stored safely in multiple places just in case Derek got any ideas about trying to retaliate. But I knew he wouldn't. He wasn't stupid enough to come after me now, not when he had so much more to lose. He knew that if he so much as breathed in my direction, I would release everything, and his entire world would come crashing down even harder than it already was. But there was still one last thing left to do, the part one had been dreading the most. Natalie needed to know the truth. I had spent so much time thinking about how to take down Derek that I hadn't allowed myself to fully process what this was going to do to my sister. She had always been blind when it came to him, defending him no matter what, making excuses for every shady thing he did, convincing herself that he was the man she wanted him to be rather than the man he actually was. I knew that telling her the truth wouldn't just break her heart. It would destroy the version of her life that she had spent years building. And no matter how much I hated Derek, I didn't take any pleasure in being the one to tear it all apart. Jessica, of course, had no such reservations. She wanted to send the recordings to every single person in our family group chat with a dramatic, "Guess who's a criminal?" message attached. But as much as I appreciated her enthusiasm, I knew that if I blindsided Natalie like that, she would never forgive me. No matter how damning the evidence was, she needed to hear it from me first, in a way that gave her the chance to process everything before the inevitable fallout. I called her early the next morning, keeping my voice as steady as possible as I told her we needed to talk in person. She could tell right away that something was wrong, but she didn't press for details, agreeing to meet me at a cafe near her office later that afternoon. The hours leading up to that meeting felt like torture, my mind running through every possible reaction she might have, every way this conversation could go completely off the rails. But when she finally walked through the door and sat down across from me, looking concerned but not yet devastated, I knew there was no turning back. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I didn't ease into it or try to soften the blow. I told her exactly what had happened, from the first blackmail email to the confrontation in the parking garage, laying out every detail in a way that left no room for doubt. I showed her the photos Derek had fabricated, played the audio of him demanding money, let her hear every sickening word that had come out of his mouth. And the entire time, she just sat there in stunned silence, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. At first, she didn't say anything. She just stared down at the phone screen as if she could force the evidence to disappear through sheer willpower, as if she could make this entire nightmare go away by refusing to acknowledge it. Then, slowly, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper as she muttered the one thing I had been afraid she would say. "There has to be an explanation." I had expected her to be in denial. I had prepared myself for it, knowing that her entire world was crumbling around her in real time and that she would grasp at anything to keep it from falling apart completely. But hearing her actually try to defend him, even after everything I had just shown her, sent a sharp wave of frustration through me. I had spent weeks gathering this proof, risking everything to make sure she knew the truth, and now she was sitting here trying to convince herself that there had to be another side to the story. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, reminding myself that this wasn't about me. Natalie, listen to me. There is no explanation that makes this okay. He tried to blackmail me. He faked evidence to ruin my career. He demanded money to keep quiet. And when I confronted him, he had nothing to say because he knew he was caught. You know him better than anyone. Do you really think he would have stayed silent if he had any way to talk himself out of this? She didn't answer. She just sat there, her breathing uneven, her hands shaking slightly as the reality of what I was saying finally started to sink in. Then, out of nowhere, she let out a choked, bitter laugh, one that held absolutely no humor, just pure disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "I married a monster." And just like that, the denial was gone. The rest of the conversation was a blur of anger, heartbreak, and betrayal, Natalie going back and forth between wanting to scream and wanting to break down completely. She kept asking herself how she hadn't seen it, how she had been so blind, how she had spent 5 years married to a man who was capable of something like this. And all I could do was sit there, letting her process it in whatever way she needed to, knowing that nothing I said would make it hurt any less. By the time we left the cafe, she had already made up her mind. She was going home to confront him, to get the truth out of him face to face, to end this marriage before he had the chance to do any more damage. I offered to go with her, but she shook her head, saying this was something she needed to do on her own. I didn't argue. I had done my part. Now it was time for her to decide what came next. I didn't hear from Natalie for the rest of the night, and even though I knew she needed space to process everything, I couldn't stop myself from checking my phone every 5 minutes, half expecting her to call and tell me Derek had somehow managed to talk his way out of this. I had seen him manipulate her too many times before, twisting every situation to make himself look like the victim while making her feel guilty for even questioning him. I knew she wanted to believe that her entire marriage hadn't been built on lies, and I was terrified that he would use that desperation to keep her on his side. But when my phone finally rang the next morning and I saw her name flash across the screen, I knew from the way my hands were shaking that I wasn't ready for whatever she was about to say. The second I answered, I could hear it in her voice. Something had broken inside of her, something that couldn't be fixed, something that had finally shattered beyond repair. She told me she had confronted Derek the moment she got home, demanding that he admit the truth, demanding to know how long he had been lying to her, demanding to understand how the man she had married had turned out to be a complete stranger. At first, he had tried to play dumb, acting shocked, acting like I had somehow fabricated the entire story to turn her against him, pretending to be hurt that she would even consider believing me over him. But when she told him she had heard the recordings, when she looked him in the eye and told him she knew everything, that was when the mask finally cracked. She said it was like watching a switch flip inside him, like the man she had spent years defending had disappeared in an instant, replaced by someone she didn't even recognize. The moment he realized he couldn't talk his way out of it, he stopped trying to be charming, stopped pretending to care, stopped putting on the performance that had fooled her for so long. Instead, he turned cold, calculating, emotionless, like she was just an obstacle standing in his way instead of the woman he had promised to love for the rest of his life. And then, in the most chilling moment of all, he told her something that made her blood run cold, something that made her realize that leaving him wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. "If you ruin my life, I'll make sure you regret it." She told me that when he said it, his voice was completely flat, completely calm, as if he wasn't even trying to scare her. He was just stating a fact. That was the moment she knew she had never really been safe with him, that he had never truly loved her, that she had spent 5 years living in a carefully constructed illusion, mistaking control for devotion and manipulation for protection. She told me she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even argue. She just turned around, packed a bag, and walked out the door without looking back. She was calling me from a hotel, trying to figure out what came next, trying to process the fact that her entire life had just collapsed in the span of a single night. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the way she sounded completely hollow, completely drained, like she had nothing left to give. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know what to say to her. I had spent so much time trying to convince her to see the truth, trying to make her understand that Derek wasn't the man she thought he was. But now that she finally knew, now that she had finally seen him for what he really was, I realized I had never actually prepared myself for what would happen next. Jessica, of course, had plenty to say when I told her everything, immediately launching into a rant about how we needed to get a lawyer involved, how Natalie needed to go to the police, how Derek couldn't just be allowed to walk away from this without consequences. And while I agreed with her, while I wanted nothing more than to see him suffer for everything he had done, I knew that Natalie wasn't ready for any of that yet. Right now, she was just trying to keep herself from falling apart, trying to figure out how to exist in a reality where the man she had built a life with had never actually been real. But Derek wasn't finished yet. 2 days after Natalie left him, my parents called me out of nowhere, demanding to know what the hell I had done to their son-in-law. Apparently, Derek had decided to go on the offensive, calling them up and telling them some sob story about how I had always hated him, how I had been jealous of his relationship with Natalie, how I had spent months plotting against him out of spite. He told them that I had fabricated evidence, that I had manipulated Natalie into believing lies, that I had deliberately set out to destroy their marriage because I couldn't stand to see her happy, and because my parents had always been so eager to believe the best about him, because they had spent years buying into the perfect image he had crafted for himself, they actually believed him. I could barely get a word in before my mother started crying, telling me that she couldn't understand why I would do something like this, asking me how I could live with myself knowing that I had torn my own sister's family apart. My father, always the more reserved one, didn't yell, didn't get emotional, didn't even ask for my side of the story. He just told me he was disappointed in me, that he had expected better, that he hoped I could find a way to make this right before it was too late. It didn't matter that I had proof, that I had undeniable evidence of everything Derek had done, that I had spent weeks meticulously gathering the truth so that he couldn't manipulate his way out of it. None of that mattered, because Derek had beaten me to them first, because he had twisted the story in a way that made me the villain and him the victim. I wanted to scream, wanted to throw my phone across the room, wanted to demand to know why they always took his side, why they refused to believe me even when I had the truth staring them in the face. But instead, I just stood there, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers ached, listening to my own parents tell me that I had ruined everything. And in that moment, I realized something that hurt even more than anything Derek had done to me. They were never going to believe me. It didn't matter what I said, didn't matter what proof I had, didn't matter how many ways I could show them that I had been the one telling the truth this entire time. They had already made up their minds, and nothing I said was ever going to change that. Derek had spent years wrapping them around his finger, slowly making them see him as the perfect son-in-law, the perfect husband, the perfect man. And now that the truth had come out, they would rather believe that I was the liar than admit that they had been fooled. But I didn't care anymore. Let them believe what they wanted. Let them side with the man who had blackmailed their own daughter. Let them turn their backs on me just to protect their own egos. I had spent too much time fighting for people who refused to fight for me, and I wasn't going to waste another second trying to convince them of something they didn't want to see. Because unlike them, I knew the truth. And that was enough. Subscribe now. Turn on the notification ringer so you don't miss a single story.